Okay. Before I get into the topics for this talk, let me grab some loose ends that have come up during the week. And some of this stuff, it's going to be questions that came during my talk. I just want to clarify the answer I gave. And then I also want to jump in on the diminishing marginal utility aspect. Before I start, I just want to explain, did you guys hear yesterday that we were all supposed to wear our shirts? I just want to explain that. I think it looks like I'm the oddball, but I think everyone else screwed up. Okay, all right. I have a nice dress shirt and tie underneath this. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So for one thing I want to just remark on is it's interesting if you noticed, and this certainly wasn't, I think that it's sincere when we say it, that the faculty, when we're each doing the chapter that we've been assigned earlier in the week, we've said things like, and this is one of the best chapters in the book, or this is, in my opinion, this is the most important chapter of the book. And it's funny that because I said that about the entrepreneurship and change chapter, and some of these other guys were talking about their chapter. Like the material that Peter Klein does, I hate that kind of stuff, and yet he was really into it and exciting. And so what's clearly happening, of course.
I feel the same way.
Right, exactly. I told you, reading Hayek's passing a stone. Of course, what's happening is that Rothbard he has great insights and is a fantastic writer on all this. Everything in here, and so whatever your specialty is, the stuff that you care about when you read Rothbard on that, it's just like, wow, this is the clearest exposition I've ever seen. Gee, I never thought of that. And he's doing it decades ago, and you're stuff that you've never even thought of. What's really embarrassing is stuff that I must have read because I wrote the study guide, and I'm reading him this time. So, gee, I never thought of that, and well, I must have, and I just forgot it. Okay, so anyway, I just wanted to point that out. Another thing people were talking about, some of this issue of, I'm not. And it comes out in some of these the questions that you guys gave before the talk or before the conference about you say things like I'm not sure I can go along with Rothbard on this, or I'm not comfortable with this, and I mean in a sense, yes, we're trying to propagandize and we're trying to proselytize and get you guys to think like we do, but it's this kind of stuff, with my own personal evolution on these matters, the first time I read Rothbard, I didn't all of a sudden say, wow, I'm an anarchist, and I didn't realize it. But no, I thought he was kind of crazy, and he's a great economist, and just the stuff about taxation. I was like, whoa, this guy's for no taxes. I knew I was low tax, but this is kind of, out there. And then it's good though, if you hear that stuff, and then what usually will happen is later on for other reasons, your views will change, and then you'll kind of recall the theoretical reasons. So like in my personal case, I kind of just thought you needed to have the U.S. military, otherwise we'd get taken over by all these countries. And it was only through coming to the Mises Institute and hearing talks by Professor Rako and others to show how it's as with any other area, that it's not merely that the government doesn't do a great job defending you, that no, the reason we're so vulnerable to all these outside attacks is because of government prohibiting private defense services, and then what the government does with its own military is go provoke people and make them want to come over here and study for 5 years and try to figure out how to kill as many Americans as possible. So, in any event, like I said, and then once you start to think that, oh, wait, actually the government's not doing a good job, then you're more susceptible to the idea that, well, maybe it's possible that you could get by in a society without having a formal government the way we mean that term. And then a lot of Rothbard stuff, it flips it's on its head, and you think stuff that might seem crazy to you when you first read it, or really flippant, like, oh, come on, he's dismissing it with one little reductio ad absurdum, but this is a serious topic. But then later on, if you come back and look at it, you're like, wow, that's really good. So let me give you an example of that. I think it's one of you keeps coming back to this diminishing marginal utility, and so that also is something where I was. I remember I didn't like that, and I even came here. I don't know if Jeff Herbner will remember it, but when I was a fellow here, the first year I used to argue. I used to pick fights with people, and I'd come in and say, "Oh, this Guido Hulsman's big. Let me go critique him," and I would try to go around and pick arguments with people. And this diminishing marginal utility was one of them. And it's the neoclassicals. They don't believe in diminishing marginal utility, or rather, the neoclassicals who actually know what their theory says don't believe in it anymore because, it doesn't. If there's no such thing as cardinal utility, and those utility functions that they use, if those are just sort of a trick, then it doesn't really mean anything when you say, oh, this bundle of apples and oranges gives 18 utils. A smart neoclassical will know that that doesn't mean anything, that there's no such thing as 18 utils. All that really means is they pick that bundle over another bundle that plugged into this utility function only gives 13 utils. That's all we mean by that. And you could double the utility function and double all the numbers or square all the numbers or whatever, and as long as those ordinal relationships are the same, it's the same utility function, because that's all it really means. And so in that context, then, yeah, diminishing marginal utility doesn't mean anything, because for a neoclassical, marginal utility is the derivative of the utility function, or, how much, if the first apple gives me 10 utils and then with 2 apples I have 20 2 apples I have 15 utils, then the marginal utility of that second apple is 5, because 15 utils minus 10. And so if we think that those overall total utilities from various bundles is meaningless, well then the difference in total utility from adding one more unit is also meaningless. So mainstream economists don't believe in diminishing marginal utility. That's why Hicks, I think it was the 1930s, had a pretty big book in terms of its impact, where he goes through and says, yeah, this guy Pareto comes up with new techniques, and we now realize we don't have to believe in psychic cardinal utility. And then, well, shoot, what do we do about the law of demand? And so then Hicks goes through and says, well, with these indifference curves, if we're not looking at an indifference curve to mean a point, a collection of points that yield the same cardinal utility, but instead are bundles that the person's indifferent between, well, then we can just talk about diminishing marginal rate of substitution on that indifference curve, and then we can try to use that to get the law of demand. Okay, so that's where the mainstream's coming from. But let me just go over something with you. And so I think that's where some of you are having trouble, that it looks like, man, if we're talking about diminishing marginal utility, isn't it kind of forcing us to think in cardinal terms? And it does, in a sense. That's the way you picture it, that, oh yeah, the first apple gives me 100 ounces or units of oomph, and then the second apple gives me fewer and fewer. But the reason, remember, for Austrians, that's not what it means. And what I like to do is, whenever you get into trouble with talking of utility, remember, for praxeology, just about always that should be reducible to something you can say about action. And so if we say an apple gives John more utility than an orange, that is the same thing as saying John would choose an apple over an orange. So if somebody says, some outsider says, I don't know what this word utility means, what do you economists mean when you say that first phrase or sentence? You could, as a praxeologist, you could say, okay, all I really mean is that John would pick the one over the other. And then you say, well, what about these preference rankings? You could say, well, it's something like that the apple is higher. And by the way, I'm not getting into the parentheses, because later on with my examples it gets more complicated and I was getting all mixed up. And so I'm not worrying about whether he has the apple or not. You get what I'm saying here. Okay, and so you say, all right, well, what about then if it's units of the same good? Okay, so what does it mean when the Austrian says the first unit of water gives John more utility than the second unit? And, and obviously we don't mean that the number of utils is higher for the first unit. So what does it mean? Well, if you wanted to translate it into something about action, you could say, well, if he had to choose between those two ends, John would choose the end to which the first unit was devoted. And then here, if you were putting the ends, so we're not putting the units, but the ends, you say, okay, the quenched thirst is higher on his value scale than having a clean body if he would drink the water instead of bathing with the first unit, and then the second unit would be devoted to taking a bath. Then that's what it would mean. And so now the issue is, as some of you were raising, well, what about those cases where you need a certain minimum number of units in order to do the thing? And so isn't there a sense in which just before that threshold is reached, the margin utility of that unit is less than the margin utility of the last one? But no, because there's really no way to translate, if you got the spirit of what I was doing with the last two examples, it's not clear how you would translate that into this type of scenario. So you might say, okay, well, what do we mean if we're going to say the 20th unit of water gives more utility than the 19th? And the idea here is that with 20 units of water, and these units are big, you could fill a swimming pool. And so, the person drinks the first one and he bathes with the second one, and he does all kinds of weird stuff in the intermediate ranges, but then if he had 20, he would fill his pool, and he really wants to go swimming. But you notice that now, because it's not really that you're just doing something with that 20th unit, when you get 20, now you're doing something entirely different with the full 20. And so, this statement is not the same thing as saying John would choose the end to which the first 20 units would be devoted over the end to which the 19th would be. And so on your value scale, you could say swimming in a pool is much more highly ranked than throwing water balloons at the mailman, which is maybe what you would do with just the 19th unit of water. You got nothing else to do. You fill up water balloons. But so this is fine. There's nothing contradictory about having this arrangement, and this might lead you to have that conclusion. But that's not. It doesn't follow that. Therefore, the margin of utility you give to the 20th unit of water is higher than the 19th. So I don't know if I answered this, but maybe you can let it fester, and then when I'm done, we can come in the Q&A and you want to argue more about this. But that's what I mean. Again, just to make sure you understand what I'm saying here, that for Austrians, everything is ultimately about action. And so if you're making utility sentences involving the word utility, and you can't even in principle translate that into something that you're saying about a person's action, then that's a warning bell that maybe that it's not really meaningful. Now, maybe you can come up with examples where Rothbard does talk about utility and there's no way you could translate, and then I'll stand corrected. But that's my reaction to that. The last loose end is this issue of hoarding, and this one came up during one of my previous talks. So the issue is, okay, yeah, we know if consumers restrict consumption and increase investment, that lengthens the structure of production, and therefore, it makes total sense that now factors are rolling over in the production process for a longer amount of time, and things are more physically productive. And so, yeah, you reduce present consumption goods, which frees up resources, which then are transformed into future consumption goods. And so that's not a problem unless entrepreneurs don't anticipate it and there's adjustment costs and things. But what happens if somebody refrains from consumption spending and then doesn't give it to a bank? They don't go themselves out and buy factors. They just stick it under their mattress. And again, even here, I think this does lead to exactly what you want, and you'd have to be a little bit more specific about, well, why are people doing that? So let me just give you one example and show why the market would do what you would want it to do in that case. So people, things are uncertain, and there's these economic malaise, and people just really aren't sure about the future. Maybe they don't know what tax policies are going to be coming in the near future, and so people just naturally kind of accumulate some cash balances, and they don't invest it because they're not sure what's coming in the future. And so if you think, okay, well, what would the entrepreneurs, if they correctly diagnosed what was going on, what would happen? So what's happened is the people are spending less on things that they normally do. They're going out to eat less. They're watching fewer movies at the theater, and they're building up their cash balances. And then you say, well, what are they doing it for? Are they all going to go to the Bahamas in 3 years? And the answer is no. And in fact, the people themselves don't know. I mean, that's, if you're hoarding in this particular scenario, I'm saying, if they're building up cash balances because of uncertainty and they're really skittish about the future. And so then what would the entrepreneurs do? Well, the people who are producers in lines that, you think no matter what the people spend their money on, they're going to need more oil or something. So the oil companies are still going to, because of now the factor prices that have fallen, because the consumer goods industries that now see a drop in their demand, they're spending less on factor prices. And so, there's workers freed up. Okay, so even though the consumers aren't taking that money and going and spending it somewhere, I mean, it doesn't mean now therefore there's unemployment. I mean, individual relative wages and prices can still adjust. So there are people who are getting laid off, waitresses that are getting let go because not as many people are going out to dinner. They got to do something, and so their wage rates will fall. So they're going to get incorporated into the higher order stages. And so my point is just that even in you're trying to rig the example so that the market can't do anything about it. Well, no, if you really think it through and if you're specific about why is it that people are spending less, they're not hoarding because they never want to spend that money ever again. The point of hoarding in this type of scenario is you might have an unexpected expense come up, or people are worried they're going to get laid off, and so on. All right. So what I'm saying is, as long as the entrepreneurs have a general idea of why is it that retail spending has dropped so much, and the banking sector realizes, well, gee, how come we don't have more deposits? I don't understand. And people say, oh, it's because consumers are really just fearful about the future relative to 2 years ago. Then that would set into motion all the things that businesses that whereas a firm that has a very specialized product, like somebody selling something, a luxury item, they probably wouldn't expand output thinking, well, yeah, people aren't spending now, but it's because they're all saving them because they want to go out and buy so the latest DVD player for their SUV. That's probably not why they're building up their cash balances. So that type of firm's not going to expand its output. Whereas, like I say, individual firms where what they're producing is a capital good that has a lot of applications, they might expand output because they know that no matter what happens the next 3 years, the people are going to need more of this stuff, whatever it is, if it's refined gasoline or what have you. Okay, so my recommendation, the general moral there is, I think if you are a little bit more specific with these what-if scenarios and try to and explain, well, what is causing this stipulated change, then that will help you understand the processes that the market would set in motion. And the last comment on that sort of point is, look, we're trying, and this is good. We're not trying to discourage questions, but yeah, you guys are smart, and you're going to come up with scenarios where things aren't going to be great. Like, what if everyone in society hates some person and they would just as soon see him die? Well, that guy's dead no matter what social system he's in. All right. So under libertarianism, I think he's got the best chance of survival because we've shown all the mechanisms. Whereas in Nazi Germany, there was no way for the person who wasn't as anti-Semitic as the next guy to hire those people because it was against the law. He would get in trouble himself. Whereas at least under libertarianism, the one pariah, if he can find someone who's willing to hire him, if it's going to be a libertarian society, then the other people can't, use force against that other property owner who's letting this guy into his land. So, but again, if everyone in the whole world hates somebody with a passion and wants him dead, he's going to be dead. Or, there's nothing peculiar with land. What if everybody, all the people under libertarianism who own water decide they don't like this guy over here? We're not going to sell him water. Well, he's going to die of thirst. And, you say, well, but again, in the grand scheme of things, what's more likely? Are people going to die from water distribution problems under libertarianism or under any alternative system? I think they're going to be, the best is going to be under libertarianism. So, again, that's to do this stuff fairly, you always want to do a comparative analysis, and we're not saying libertarianism is bulletproof and nothing could ever conceivably go wrong with it. We're just saying, in our minds, from a rights point of view, yet libertarianism is always superior in terms of its abstract justice, and then in terms of pragmatics, I have not come up with an argument or an example where I would say, yep, if we had a coercive monopoly doing this thing, that would probably be better than if we had competing voluntary firms providing it. Okay, again, I got two huge topics here, so let me just talk a little. I'm going to focus on the business cycle stuff because that's what I've been doing most of my work on it. Obviously, if you guys want to ask questions in the Q&A about the later chapter, we can do that too. So I alluded to earlier in the week that I used to work at a financial firm, and there was a lot of good economists there, and they did not see any of this housing bubble stuff coming. And again, it wasn't because they were blind; it was because they had a bad business cycle theory. And you look at tax policy, trade policy, all sorts of things. I mean, we kid about, oh, these Republicans are terrible, and yeah, they spend a lot of money. But I mean, compared to governments around the world, and even compared to previous episodes in U.S. history, what the Bush administration had done wasn't that bad. I mean, they did cut taxes. They didn't cut them in the way that would have been best for economic efficiency, but they cut taxes and they did things like that, and they were privatizing things, or at least moving in the right direction on certain areas. And even on monetary policy, now this is what's really interesting, is you talk to monetarists, and they say, yeah, the Fed, if you look just at money supply figures, and I don't have that particular figure in front of me to show you, but yeah, after the dot-com bust, there was rates of certain monetary aggregates, their yearly growth, or however you want to measure it, were higher than average, so you could say that would be a cause for concern. But then the Fed did bring it under control. All right, relative to historical trends, and years had gone by since the irresponsible part, and so that's why I say talking to supply side economists, the guys you'd see on CNBC and things like that, 18 months ago even, they weren't too fearful of the future because they said, look, the Fed's got stuff under control now. Yeah, they got a little ahead of themselves a few years ago, but we got through that, and now everything's fine. Look at prices. Look at the bond market. That's not anticipating inflation beyond anything moderate, and so what's the problem? And so what they're missing there is the time lag, and really that's why it's crucial. And I was going over before when I was showing you those structure of production diagrams, that if you're not thinking of it like that, if you're thinking, of course in a simple crude Keynesian model, but even in a more sophisticated mainstream model that's got different capital sectors and things like that, they don't really have a structure of production in there. I mean, there is, as some of you know, an Arrow-Debreu general equilibrium framework where you have T equals 0 to T equals, infinity, and you've got for different time periods, and you've got an array of goods at every period. You can have a spot price for everything going into the future. And so they could handle it theoretically, but that's not the way they do it. I mean, they get very general results for that. They don't have a day-to-day, how do I think about the business cycle and think of it in terms of a structure of production that might be 10 stages long, and how, if interest rates are too low, there could be malinvestment, and that might set into motion a chain of events that 3 years from now is really going to hit. Okay, so that's why, like I say, they thought they had gotten through the worst of it. And also, the other thing is, if you're a monetarist and you think the Fed is pumping too much money into the economy, the reason that's bad is because prices are going to go up, and that causes, uncertainty. It's hard for business people to plan because prices are rising in the value of their money, and it's uncertain. So that's really the main sin of excessive money growth for a monetarist, is that prices get out of whack, and it sort of dilutes the function of prices giving signals to people. But it's not that it sets into motion the business cycle. That's not the way monetarists think of things. And so, as I say, I had this sort of view, and then once I finally left the firm and I started looking at stuff with fresh eyes, this graph in particular is what really sort of terrified me and made me lose my complacent view. Okay, so I don't know if you can... So this is coming from an article I wrote for Mises.org. It was called the worst business cycle, or the worst recession in 25 years, or some title that Jeff Tucker gave it to really make people say, holy cow, I mean, look at this article. Let's see. It's... So what this is, this line down here is the real Fed funds rate, and then this line up here is real GDP growth. And so we're getting short on time anyway, so I won't belabor the point. But the idea here is, right. Let's see, this has got to be going to the left one, and then this is going to the right one. Okay, so it's the real, so you see people say, well, you guys just spin stuff off in your head. And at this point, I was kind of doing this just to be honest with you, to see, do I even believe in the Austrian business cycle theory? Or, because the theory can be true, but maybe there's other things going on. Okay, so, just to give you a quick example, the 82 recession, Arthur Laffer has an explanation of that, and he says that he thinks it's because of the Reagan tax cuts, ironically, because what they did, and these guys are just idiots, they passed, Reagan's big 25% reductions, but they phased it in over time. Okay, so they passed them early, and then they phased them in. And so what happened is, if you had a business deal going down and it was supposed to go down in 81, you might push it back a year because you're going to get taxed at a lower rate in 82. And the story is that Laffer went to Reagan after everything got passed, and they phased it in because of concerns about the deficit. All right, that they were saying, well, no, if we give the tax cut too soon, then we're going to lose all that money up front. So why don't we phase in the pain to the Treasury? So the people going along with it didn't believe in the Laffer curve, obviously. And as Laffer tells the story, he went to Reagan and said, once it went through, that he said, well, I don't like this phase in. And he said, why? And he said, because he said, well, imagine that your favorite store, you found out that next week they're going to have a really big sale. Are you going to make a big ticket purchase this week? And he said that Reagan got it, just went, oh, how bad is it going to be? So, that was interesting that Reagan got what he was saying. But anyway, so the point is, you don't need to, I don't think it's correct to try to look at every recession in U.S. history and say, how did the Fed cause that necessarily? I think some stuff can be tax policy, or in the 90s with, Bush's seniors tax raise. You might say that could. But anyway, the point is here, no, it does look like what you would expect, that the two move inversely, so that when the Fed cuts rates by pumping money in the economy, typically, real GDP grows, and vice versa. And so that kind of fits the general story, but that's not so much, lots of schools of thought might agree with that. But yeah, it's stimulated, and then when you restrict it, it contracts. But like I said, what really worried me here is the real federal funds rate here was the lowest it had been since the late 1970s. And so if you believed in Austrian business cycle theory, this was certainly something that made you sit up and take notice that, wow, that the Fed, in the mid-2000s there, early 2000s, it set interest rates very low. And what I'm doing there by real Fed funds rate is adjusting for price inflation to try to get a sense of, here, nominal interest rates that the Fed was setting for short-term loans were higher than they were later on, but price inflation was really high. And so you want to say, well, how much were you getting back on your loans? Okay, so here, when I saw this was before the credit crunch hit and all that stuff. And so this looked like, we had sown the seeds, and I admit to you, I wasn't sure. I said, but gee, if the Austrian business cycle theory means anything, then it looks like there's really serious trouble coming, and that's not what a lot of people were saying. And then obviously that is what happened. Like shortly after I constructed this thing, then I saw that there was the credit crisis hit and so on. And incidentally, if some of you try to bust me and come and go look this thing up and say, wait a minute, your article came out after everyone knew there was stuff going on, I knew it before, and then I waited until the article came out. Okay, so there was a lag. So anyway, like I say, this really did, in a sense, give me. I saw a lot of this stuff coming before a lot of other sharp economists did, precisely because I had heard of the Austrian business cycle theory. Let me see. Let me talk about objections to the Austrian business cycle theory. And then I'll go over this, and then we can open it up for more spontaneous question and answer. I think there's a lot of work to be done in taking the canonical Austrian business cycle theory and updating it and putting it into dealing with modern institutions and things that have changed. And this is the biggest single objection, and I'm sure in the Q&A Dr. Block is going to jump into on this because he's written a lot in response. The single biggest objection that mainstream economists will give is the rational expectations objection. So there is some fairness in that criticism. If you read earlier expositions, things by Mises and Hayek, they do make it sound like the entrepreneurs sometimes just mechanically respond. And when the government lowers interest rates, entrepreneurs think that there's a higher supply of saving, and so they go out and invest. And it is true that you might say, well, they could have been fooled the first 3 times, but why do the entrepreneurs keep falling for the trick? Okay, so that's what the objection is. There's two main responses. So one that Walter Block has done, and maybe he has other responses too, but one that I know he has mentioned, is that there's it's not merely, I'm trying to figure out a way to describe it. Even if everyone knows it's happening, you can't stop it. Okay, so the way I would tell my students is, look, if the government printed up $1 trillion in cash and put it out in some swamp area, where there's snakes and things, and there's all kinds of deadly berries around there, so you got to be careful what you eat, and it's really dangerous, and there's quicksand and everything. It would be better for society, in a sense, if we all could just agree, okay, let's nobody go out and try to get that $1 trillion of cash sitting there. Okay, if we just ignore it, everything will go on. It'll be as if it doesn't exist. But yet, that's kind of irresistible, and so people are going to go out there, and 100 people are going to die from, getting bitten by snakes and things like that. And then the few that do get through and come back are going to then have all this money and spend it, and that's not going to be a social improvement because it's not gold. It's just, pieces of green paper sitting out there, and they're going to raise prices and cause hyperinflation and all that stuff. Okay, so you could see the sense in which if we could all just agree, let's ignore that free money that the government printed up and sitting there, we'd all be better off, but we just can't, all right? And it's certainly, if the government did do that and print up tons of money and then cause all these problems, and we had to send out rescue teams to get people out of the bog and so forth that were trying to get the money, and an economist said, well, the government should stop doing that, it would be silly for someone to say, well, if people had rational expectations, they would realize that that's just going to, be a zero-sum game and a negative-sum game, and so you guys are crazy. That you would say, well, expectations have nothing to do with it, how can people ignore it? That's the incentives. It's a prisoner's dilemma type situation. So that's one response, that in a sense, when the government enters the credit markets with fiduciary media, then it's, you've got the bank over here, and they've got backed notes, backed by gold or whatever, and say, here, we'll lend you this at 5%, and the government's saying, okay, well, we'll give you an identical piece of paper at 4%. And how are the entrepreneurs going to, it would have to be like a code of honor among all the all the banks that are in the Federal Reserve System to say, no, we're not taking any government funding. And so, even if they wanted to, I'm not even sure that they would be able to. Just technologically or institutionally, if they would be able to just not accept the government money in that sense. Okay, so, and then clearly, the average person running a major bank doesn't care about that kind of stuff. They're just going to say, well, hey, I'm going to take it because that's the way the system is. I'll vote for Ron Paul, but as it is, the system's like this. I'm taking the money. Okay, so that's one answer. And then the other more, even if you want to try to deal with it on its own terms, I don't like it when a mainstream economist makes it sound like all the people would have to do is just build in expectations and say, yeah, so all people have to do is they look at the money supply figures and then they say, okay, well, what is the real interest, the correct market interest rate, and then what is the messed up, distorted interest rate, and then you just try to weed those effects out. That's sort of overlooking the whole role of prices coordinating economic behavior. All right, that if you think people could just automatically net out the effects of government distortions, well, then that kind of makes it sound like they wouldn't have needed the original market prices in the first place because they kind of can figure those out just looking at the fundamentals. All right, but that's not true. Obviously, market prices really do help coordinate activity, and so if the government messes with those prices, you can't just adjust the prices to unmess it up. Okay, and I think entrepreneurs do try to adjust for it. Like, people aren't completely complacent, and they do. There are Fed watching people, and they write newspaper columns and things, or newsletters for their clients. And it is true that, a lot of what, if you've been following this closely in the U.S. this last year, a lot of what the Fed has been trying to do hasn't really taken. I mean, the Fed has engaged in unprecedented activities, things that they haven't done since the 30s, or even now with Bernanke talking up the dollar and things. I mean, they're doing stuff that they normally don't do. And it's just allowing the economy to limp by. That might give a boost on stock prices for a couple days, and then another bank's report comes out, and then the stock market tanks again. And then they go, oh, wait a minute, what trick do we need to pull out now? Okay, so my point is that the market is discounting a lot of what the Fed has done, whereas if the Fed had done these types of things back in 1953, maybe there would have been a much bigger impact because the market wouldn't have been as savvy, and they just wouldn't have seen what the Fed was capable of and realized this as much. All right, so it's sort of like an arms race, I think, that where the Fed keeps doing more and more interventions and the market keeps trying to sidestep it, and it doesn't always quite work. I mean, the Fed is going to keep pushing the envelope until it gets the outcome that it wants. All right, so that's what I would say there. And I, for those of you who want afterwards, if you want to talk about it, I mean, I have a model that I wrote up. That's being, the first journal I said who didn't like it, but where you do a purely rational expectations model, and I can show you, I can generate business cycles and things when the government messes with the interest rate.